as the latest phase of the Post Office inquiry comes to an end, a former Fujitsu helpline employee, Nate Oro, has told ITV News about his experience working at the height of the scandal and how staff would be punished if they admitted to flaws in the Horizon system.
Nate worked at the tech firm, answering many of the desperate calls from Sub-Postmasters and received a shocking company attitude towards Sub-Postmasters when they called up for help. Let's just take a look.
We were under no illusion that the system wasn't good. You know, we hated supporting it. It was a bad piece of software.
Were you allowed to say that to the Sub-Postmasters?
Of course not. No. I mean, if anybody ever made any kind of suggestion that was the case, you know, they'd be sort of dragged over the coals if the call was listened to. Genuinely, more often than not, it was a mystery. The most you could do was try to comfort them and say you'd escalate it up.
Joining us now are two former Sub-Postmasters, Christopher Head, once the youngest Sub-Postmaster in the country, who was wrongly accused of theft, and Lee Castleton, whose story featured heavily in the ITV drama. He was ordered to repay a shortfall of £25,000. Lee, Christopher, you've just heard that. The Post Office destroyed your lives, and those in leadership destroyed your lives. Fujitsu, all part of what I'm going to call a conspiracy amongst them to cover up. You've heard what happened after the 91 calls where Fujitsu employees were told to say it was OK. Before we get into the details of compensation and the horrors you've been through, just help me and our viewers out there understand how it feels when you hear that.
It's so difficult because, I mean, them people there, they could have come out much earlier, and obviously you helped us expose this at a much earlier stage. And it's hard. It's hard to watch. You know, you think that you can't uncover anything more in this, and then, you know, a few days later, something else comes out.
It's the feeling of them knowing. You know, they knew 20 years ago. For me, they knew, and for 20 years they've just spun me and my family around, and the whole of the victims just round and round and round, and not cared. Just not cared. And
it's interesting, isn't it, hearing, you know, Nate Oro there, when he was talking about the fact, he went on to sort of talk about every Wednesday, which was a counting day, and they would dread it because they knew they were going to be bombarded by calls. You know, people like you, who I know had rung 91 times, hadn't
Just
you?
the same feeling at the other end of the phone, to be fair. The Wednesday balance was a frightful, fearful thing, and especially if you were going through the difficulties that we all went through, which was trying to understand what was going wrong, but also trying to navigate this plethora of difficulty at the other end of the phone, where people just seemed as though either purposefully they weren't understanding or the system itself just was wrong.
Now, just to clarify, I may have called it a conspiracy. The findings of the inquiry are yet to be concluded, and we'll wait for phase 5. That's not a conclusion. Now, with that legal throat clearing aside, I just simply don't understand. I think a lot of people out there don't. You call 91 times, you end up in court. Now, had you been represented by well-funded lawyers, or been a big corporation, or been people with power, you'd have said, hey, this thing doesn't add up, and you'd have demanded, and what's more, you probably would have got disclosure of all of the communication between Fujitsu and the Post Office, and perhaps this would have emerged. To what extent do you think, as we all feel now, having watched your story, this isn't just a story about corruption, let's say, assuming it's concluded, in the Post Office or in Fujitsu, assuming that that's concluded in due course. It's a story about people who simply don't have power or those to assist them navigate.
It's, you know, one of the themes throughout this has been disclosure the whole way through the path. So one of the things that Stephen Dilley, one of the lawyers for Post Office, explained in the inquiry was that he didn't want to swamp me personally. I was a litigant on my own, and he felt that not disclosing documents, huge amounts of documents, actually helped me.
Right. Let's look at the issue of the compensation, because, of course, this is being talked about a lot, isn't it? We know that Alan Bates has spoken out about his, criticising it as being cruel. And I know for you, Chris, you again have had a similar situation, haven't you, where you submitted a claim and have just been offered a fraction of that?
Yeah, I submitted the claim in before Alan, actually, in June last year, and they offered me on the 28th of December last year just under 15% of the value of the claim.
15%?
15%, yeah.
And so just to be clear, this isn't a figure that you came up with on your own. This was one that was, you know, worked out, taking into account everything that had happened to you in the situation.
Yeah, so I mean, that's what we've responded just recently, that, you know, this wasn't a fanciful made-up claim. This was, you know, professional forensic accountants, backed up with your tax records and all the other disclosure that's there, in order to come up with a professionally qualified claim.
How does that make you feel from the point of view that the government have said that they want to do full and fair compensation for people?
Well, I think that's what I've said, is that, you know, they say that they want to put you back in the position you would have been in full and fair, but yet we can only judge it by their actions. And at the bottom of the letter, when they tell you what they want to offer you, basically says that they have no intention of doing what they're promising to do.
15%, and there are 3 different schemes that you have to apply to. It's a complete mess. And you put it absolutely perfect. You put it perfectly. You know, you're not applying for punishing damages, which, by the way, if this were in America, you'd get a great deal more. Yeah. You're asking to be restored, even though it's impossible. Think of the number of people who have died. Think of the loss of your reputation. There's no money, presumably, that can ever pay for that. But you're asking to be restored to the position you would have been in financially but this happening, including, by the way, the money for your lawyers that you've had to pay as well. What do you say? What's your view about that 15%?
I mean, I said I just didn't think it could be as bad. You know, I knew that, you know, there may be some negotiations down the line. I said, you know, maybe if they come to the table with a 50% offer and you're already halfway, and then you're going to try to close the gap. But I just, all the promises that they were making in the lead up to that offer, you know, they kept saying to us in communications that they didn't want to make an insulting offer. They wanted the offer to be meaningful. And they were saying all these things. So you were kind of getting your hopes that you were going to actually draw this to a close. And then when that dropped on the doorstep, you're like, it just couldn't believe it.
Because for you, what impact has it had on your life? You were hounded for £88,000 for almost 5 years. I mean, the stress of that, and also bearing in mind, you know, you were once the youngest sub-postmaster in the country, weren't you?
Yeah, so I mean, I'd already repaid over £22,000 over the 8.5 years that I was there. And then the final one, they did a criminal investigation that they dropped with, they didn't give a reason why. And then they went down this civil route. And that was put on a stay because Alan had the group litigation order granted. And that was sat on my head for another 5 years before that case concluded.
Can you help me and those out there with what we call reputational injury, but that doesn't go even close to what it's like. What the stigma was for over a decade of being a central person in your community who's now accused of theft and dishonesty. Just help me understand that. The programme did it, but it's staggering.
For me, I lived in a small fishing town in the northeast, and my family were abused in the street. It was just horrific. You know, 20 years this has happened for me personally, and it's so difficult to watch that kind of behaviour to your family. To me, fair enough, but my children.
What does it do to you, thinking back? I know how it makes me, and I suspect millions of our viewers, feel.
We're still picking pieces up. You know, 20 years on, we're still picking parts of our lives back up again.
Yeah. Now, as I used perhaps clumsy language, not on purpose, perhaps, but I don't think this is a story that, frankly, we can be impartial about. This is one of the biggest injustices in British legal history. But I wonder, as we come to phase 5, and as more emerges about what Paula Vennells may not have known, and others, by the way, including the previous CEO, I wonder what your feeling is and attitude is towards them, if it is discovered in due course, if that they were engaged in a cover-up. What's your feeling about what the law should do to them? How should the law be applied to them?
I just want them to be judged. For me, personally, whatever comes out, however that pans out, it's something that they need to stand in front of, whatever kind of court that might be, and be judged. I think we all, as a nation, deserve justice in whatever form that takes. And I look forward to it. Bring it on. We've never had anything to hide. We're very open. We try and help push this along as much as we can. We can't say that for the other side. Post Office have never been open. Let's see what the real truth is. I'm really looking forward to it.
Chris, for you, how key do you think this next phase of the inquiry will be?
Yeah, I think it's obviously we're going to talk about the people that had the chance to maybe stop this at some point. You know, they were given information from the mediation scheme, from second sight investigators, you know, back in 2013. They had a choice back then to either go down the road of what we think is a cover-up, or they could have stopped it and said, look, we have to get to the bottom of this. And they chose the first.
Well, I think it's not difficult to speak for the nation, to say that everybody hopes you get the compensation, not that you just deserve, but that you're entitled to. Thank you so much for your courage coming here and
Thank you.
coming to speak to all of us. A Post Office spokesman said, "We are deeply sorry for the pain and suffering, the events of the Horizon IT scandal, of the events of them. We fully share the aims of the current public inquiry set up to get to the truth of what's happened."
And to reflect what the Fujitsu group are saying, they said that they offers their deepest apologies to the Sub-Postmasters and their family. They say they remain steadfast in their commitment to cooperating, and they're working with the UK government on appropriate actions, including contribution to compensation. We will wait to see with interest what comes next.